Emily stepped out of the Greyhound bus into the sticky warmth of an Ohio afternoon. The town of Willow Creek hadn't changed much since she left a decade ago. Still quiet, still slow, still wearing its seasonal flowers like a badge of polite pride. But nothing felt familiar. Not the courthouse square, not the rows of old sycamores, not even the scent of cut grass that once reminded her of home. She stood with her duffel bag clutched in one hand and her mother's address glowing on her phone screen. It had been 10 years since she'd called this place home. Now she was back, not to reconnect, but to prepare for an ending. The phone call had come a month earlier. Margaret's voice, tight and clipped as always, delivered the diagnosis like a weather report. Pancreatic cancer. Terminal. 6 months, maybe less. Emily had listened in silence, her hand going numb around the receiver. There was no plea, no apology, just a short pause, and then the expectation. Come home. She had. She left her job at the trauma unit, sublet her apartment, said goodbye to a life she'd carefully built without ever asking why. The house looked exactly as she remembered. A white bungalow with green shutters and flower boxes, but now trimmed in pale pink ribbons and porch railings covered in sympathy cards. Bouquets of lilies and roses lined the steps, their scent cloying and artificial in the summer heat. Someone had delivered a banner to the door that read, "Stay strong, Margaret." A tray of casseroles rested near the doormat beside a stack of glossy, get-well balloons. Emily walked through the front door and into a curated performance of suffering. The living room was spotless, almost unnaturally so, with candles lit on every surface and a guest book open on the foyer table. Margaret sat in the armchair by the window, dressed in a soft robe with a fleece blanket across her lap, a cup of peppermint tea cradled in one hand. Her complexion was flushed, her hair freshly blown out, her eyes bright. She looked like she was waiting to be interviewed for a local news segment. That first hour passed in a haze of polite conversation and logistical catch-up. Margaret offered a list of medication names, vague references to specialists, and an overview of her planned, treatment-free final months. She described her graceful acceptance of death as though it were a curated lifestyle choice. Emily nodded, took notes, and tried not to blink too hard every time her mother coughed delicately into a lace handkerchief. Over the following days, Emily watched carefully. She moved into her old childhood bedroom, now sterilized and repainted in shades of pastel. She sorted pills by color and time of day, prepared nutrient-rich meals, and read every pamphlet on late-stage pancreatic cancer she could get her hands on. But something didn't align. Margaret never seemed to be in pain. Her appetite remained steady. She declined pain medication, citing sensitivity, but accepted homemade soup and wine with equal ease. Emily noticed she only mentioned fatigue when guests were around, and only coughed during conversations that included sympathy. People stopped by in steady waves, church friends, neighbors, former students. They brought hand-knitted scarves and prayer cards, wept openly in the foyer, kissed Margaret's cheek with reverence. Each time, Margaret responded with practiced humility, smiling softly, hands folded, a martyr bathed in candlelight. After they left, she'd snap back into sharp clarity, commenting on their weight gain, their children's poor manners, or the quality of their gifts. Emily kept her questions to herself. But late at night, she would sit in the hallway with her laptop, poring over medical journals and comparing them to the patterns in her mother's behavior. Something was wrong. Not just with Margaret's health, but with the narrative. It was too clean, too crafted, too convenient. And as the pink ribbons continued to multiply across the porch railing, Emily felt something begin to calcify in her chest, not sadness, not pity, but suspicion. Emily began noticing the inconsistencies on the fourth day. It started with the absence of painkillers. Her mother spoke often, almost theatrically, of the terrible stabbing pain in her abdomen. But when Emily opened the kitchen cabinet marked medications, she found only herbal teas, low-dose aspirin, and a handful of multivitamins in a plastic weekly organizer. No opioids, no anti-nausea pills. Nothing remotely consistent with late-stage cancer care. At first, she gave Margaret the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she preferred natural remedies. Maybe she had a higher tolerance. But Margaret often clutched her side dramatically during phone calls or whenever neighbors visited. She'd wince when lowering herself into a chair, only to rise with surprising ease minutes later to fetch a second slice of pie. One night, while Margaret was napping, Emily took her chance. She crept into the upstairs hallway and opened the linen closet where she'd seen her mother stash old documents. Inside were carefully arranged binders and a metal file box labeled medical. Emily sat on the floor, pulling the box toward her with a tight chest and trembling hands. Inside, the folders were color-coded and meticulously arranged. Blood work, imaging, prescriptions. Everything seemed in order until she looked closer. The blood test results were printouts, but the formatting looked off. The headers didn't match the typical structure she'd seen working in clinics. The physician's name was generic, and the phone number beneath it lacked an area code. A CT scan summary listed symptoms instead of findings, almost as if it had been copied from a symptom checker online. The dates were recent, but the ink on one document was smudged, as if printed at home. Emily's stomach turned as she flipped through another folder marked Correspondence. There were no envelopes, just single sheets folded in half. The language was overly formal and impersonal. One even misspelled Margaret's name. That detail struck her harder than expected. Her mother would never tolerate being addressed incorrectly. Unable to hold back suspicion, Emily wrote down the name of the clinic on the reports. She waited until morning to call, under the pretense of verifying insurance records. The woman who answered was kind but firm. No patient by that name had ever been seen there. No appointments, no oncologist by that name worked at their facility. Emily thanked her and hung up slowly. The silence in the kitchen felt colder than it should have been. Outside, the wind chimes clattered gently. Inside her mind, a storm began to gather. She sat at the dining table, surrounded by sympathy cards and vases. All this was a performance. She thought back to childhood. Margaret had always used illness like a key to unlock attention. When Emily's father once packed a suitcase, Margaret collapsed in the hallway with phantom chest pains. When Emily won a science competition, Margaret missed the ceremony with a sudden hospital stay. Each time Emily shined, Margaret dimmed the light by stepping into crisis. Now the pattern repeated, but the stage was bigger, the stakes higher. The town was praising her grace in dying, and no one, not the church, the neighbors, nor even her own uncle, questioned it. That night, Emily stood in the bathroom and stared at her reflection, not in shock, but in recognition. Her mother wasn't dying, she was performing, and Emily had seen this play before. The illness took on a life of its own. Within 2 weeks, Margaret's condition was no longer a private tragedy, but a communal performance. The church bulletin led with her photo and a paragraph about her graceful acceptance of the Lord's will. Donation jars appeared across town. Handmade posters lined the town square bulletin board. At Sunday service, the pastor offered a prayer for her, suffering with dignity. Then came the television crew. A local news station contacted Margaret for an interview. She agreed instantly. Emily watched as cameras were set up. Margaret wore a pale blue cardigan and pearls, her hair curled, her cheeks blushed. She spoke softly about pain, hope, forgiveness, and the blessing of having her daughter home again. The anchor nodded sympathetically. The cameraman zoomed in as Margaret dabbed her eye. Behind her, Emily stood like a ghost, invisible in her own childhood home. After they left, Margaret stood up without help, peeled off her cardigan, and lifted equipment boxes with ease. Emily remained still. The performance was over. Margaret went into the kitchen whistling. That night, Emily began documenting. She started small. Photos of pill bottles with no pharmacy labels, screenshots of texts with winking emojis. One read, "Maybe I should get an Oscar." Another, "These casseroles are worth the act alone." Then came the audio. Emily hid a recorder in the parlor between cushions. While she pretended to run errands, Margaret's friend Cheryl came by. Emily later played the tape back, heart pounding. Cheryl asked about treatments. Margaret laughed. What treatments? Easier to play the saint. They giggled. How much have they raised? Nearly 12,000, Margaret answered, and we haven't even gotten to the fundraising brunch. Emily sat still, fury rising. She saved the file, backed it up twice, and created a folder called Margaret. Each day brought more material. Margaret posing for photos, accepting baskets, resting on the couch, then organizing the attic. The performance started to crack. She forgot to limp. She opened wine. She complimented a lasagna she claimed she was too weak to eat. Emily had seen the empty container in the recycling bin. The town saw none of it. Margaret was their saint. Emily was cast as the loyal daughter. But to Emily, it was all a lie wrapped in pearls and candlelight. She didn't want revenge, not yet. She wanted truth, and she knew it wouldn't come in silence but in spectacle. She planned carefully. One evening, one orchestrated night when the curtain would fall and Margaret would finally be seen. The invitations went out with gold trim and delicate script. Margaret titled the event An Evening of Gratitude and insisted on handwritten notes. Emily watched silently as her mother wrote messages filled with words like blessed, grace, and journey. The guest list grew fast. Margaret reserved the event room at the town's historic inn. Emily offered help, projector, music, setup, while quietly setting the stage. The night of the dinner arrived. Guests came holding cards and casseroles. Margaret greeted them in soft ivory and pearls. She smiled weakly, hand trembling just enough to draw murmurs of sympathy. The room was filled with perfume, piano music, and polite sorrow. Emily accepted compliments and stayed near the projector. The file on her USB stick was labeled Memories. Her heart pounded. Dinner was quiet, with toasts and verses. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a napkin and stared upward, saintly in posture. Then dessert. Emily tapped her glass and introduced the slideshow. The lights dimmed. Photos appeared. Family moments, vacations, soft nostalgia. Then came the shift. A screenshot. If one more person brings soup, I'll fake a coma. Nervous laughter. Someone murmured, a joke? Another message. Church people are so easy to guilt. I should have done this years ago. Whispers rose. Faces changed. An audio clip played, Margaret saying, what treatments? Easier to play the saint that way. Silence gripped the room. More evidence. Placebo pills, spa appointments, video of Margaret lifting mulch. The room fidgeted. Someone gasped. Margaret sat frozen. She lunged for the projector remote, but Emily had disabled it. Their eyes met. Margaret's panic. Emily's resolve. Another clip. They love a tragedy, Cheryl, especially when it's dressed in pearls. A sharp laugh, a shocked whisper. The slideshow ended. Some lies are too big for one person to carry forever. Silence stretched. Then came movement. Margaret tried to speak, but no one listened. People left. A few looked at Emily. The reporters slipped away. Chairs scraped, music gone. The chandeliers still glowed. In the middle of it all stood Margaret, no longer performing. The pearls around her neck looked heavy now, too heavy to wear. By morning, the story had spread beyond the event room. Radio hosts whispered it between traffic and weather. Social media buzzed with coded shock. No names were needed. Everyone in Willow Creek already knew. The town split. Some defended Margaret. Others quietly stood by Emily. At the cafe, women argued. One called Emily cruel. The other said Margaret used them all as background players in her play. Margaret went silent. Curtains closed. Her porch, once full of sympathy, stood bare. Reporters knocked. Phones rang. No one answered. Even friends stopped coming. The pastor visited. Margaret met him, pale and still. What they said remained between them. Later that week, the charity requested all unused donations returned. The director apologized, promising new verification protocols. The dinner video leaked, first quietly, then everywhere. This wasn't just family. It was a town-wide reckoning. The local paper ran a piece titled, "When Trust is a Performance." Margaret smiled in the photo beneath a now ironic banner. The article didn't accuse. It didn't need to. It asked about community, truth, and the cost of pretending not to see. Emily read it on the back porch where she once played. There were no calls, no apologies, just silence and space. Not relief, not triumph, just space. A quiet where noise used to be. Over 2 days, she packed slowly. No one came. She left no note. The house remained neat and lovely, but the illusion had cracked, and that was enough. She passed the church, the gas station, the diner. Its prayers for Margaret sign was gone. The window was empty. She didn't look back. The road ahead was wide and gray. For the first time, Emily felt solid beneath her feet. She wasn't the liar or the broken one. Even if the town healed and forgot, she wouldn't. Not from bitterness, from clarity. Because the truth had seen daylight, and Emily didn't need permission to exist anymore. The play was over. She stepped off the stage, no longer a character in someone else's script, just herself, finally, fully, herself. A year passed with quiet precision. Emily lived in a coastal town, 3 states away. No one knew her name or past. She worked part-time at a clinic, walked by the shore, moved slowly for the first time in years. Silence became freedom. Then came the essay. It started in a notebook, written in sleepless nights. A friend urged her to publish. She did. The Saint Who Wasn't Sick. Published without names. The story spread fast. It gave words to something many had lived, but never named. Munchausen by proxy through narrative. Emails poured in. Women wrote of mothers who collapsed at graduations, invented illness, demanded spotlight. They thanked her not for naming her mother, but for naming the pattern. Invitations followed. Trauma panels, clinician workshops, survivor roundtables. Emily spoke softly, never claiming survivor status. But her words brought silence, the kind that meant understanding. Back in Willow Creek, Margaret disappeared. House sold, curtains opened, porch repainted. The jars and dinners, gone, no goodbyes. Margaret moved, changed her name. No one looked for her. Emily didn't either. She had no need to chase shadows. The story was no longer about Margaret. It was about the people who'd lived inside someone else's version of love. Emily began writing more. Essays, guides, clinical tools. She helped train others to hear what had once been unspeakable. At one event, someone asked what she hoped people took from it all. Emily paused, then said, "Love without honesty is performance. Care through control isn't care. Silence isn't peace." Her words weren't for the past. They were for daughters learning to exist. For women wondering if they were the problem. For girls who grew up invisible in applause. For those mistaking sacrifice for love. Emily's voice lived beyond the stage now. It belonged to no character. And in its clarity, it carried further than she ever imagined.